There's a quiet moment most people experience somewhere in their 30s. You're in the middle of an ordinary day, maybe having coffee, maybe driving home, and a thought surfaces out of nowhere. When did I become this person? Not in a dramatic way, not with anxiety, just genuine curiosity. Like you're looking at yourself from a slight distance and noticing that the human living your life today is noticeably different from the one who existed 10 years ago. The values shifted. The things that used to excite you feel distant. Relationships that once felt essential have quietly faded. And somehow, you care far less about what other people think. Not because you worked on it, but because something inside you simply changed. Here's what's fascinating about that feeling. It isn't random. It isn't a sign that something went wrong. What you're sensing is one of the most well-documented psychological phenomena in adult development. A fundamental reorganization of identity that neuroscience and personality research say is not only normal, but almost inevitable after a certain point in life. So let's talk about what's actually happening. For most of your teens and early 20s, your sense of identity was largely constructed from the outside in. You absorbed your environment, your family's expectations, your social group's values, the culture you were raised in. Psychologists call this the foreclosed or moratorium stage of identity development. You were, in many ways, wearing an identity that was handed to you, and it fit well enough. It got you through school, through friendships, through early career decisions. But here's the thing about borrowed identities. They tend to crack under pressure. In your late 20s and into your 30s, life delivers a specific kind of pressure that earlier decades simply don't. Career realities don't match the story you told yourself. Relationships reveal things about you that are uncomfortable to examine. Losses happen, not always dramatic ones, but quiet ones. Dreams get revised, and slowly, the scaffolding of that borrowed identity starts to feel tight. Neuroscience offers one explanation for why this shift accelerates in the 30s. Research on the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for long-term reasoning, self-reflection, and value assessment, shows it continues developing well into your mid-20s, but it's in the late 20s to mid-30s that it reaches a kind of functional maturity. You become more capable of genuine self-examination, not just reacting, but reflecting. And reflection, it turns out, is deeply disruptive to inherited identities. Consider this for a moment. Psychologist Dan McAdams, who spent decades studying how people narrate their own lives, found something striking. Adults who undergo significant identity shifts don't experience them as loss, at least not entirely. They experience them as a process of authorship. For the first time, they're not just living a story that was written for them, they're choosing the next chapter. This is partly why people in their 30s often describe feeling more themselves than they ever did in their youth, even though they can barely recognize the person they used to be. But there's a paradox here worth sitting with. The very things that make you feel more authentic after 30, the stricter boundaries, the narrowed social circle, the sharper sense of what you will and won't tolerate, can also feel isolating. Research on social network patterns shows that people consistently reduce the size of their inner circle as they age, not because of failure or bitterness, but because the brain begins to prioritize quality of connection over quantity. Psychologist Laura Carstensen calls this socioemotional selectivity theory. As your sense of time becomes more defined, your emotional priorities sharpen. You stop investing in relationships that don't reflect who you're becoming. That's not withdrawal. That's refinement. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, and it's one that psychology researchers have found genuinely difficult to answer. How much of the person you are after 30 is the result of conscious choice, and how much is simply adaptation? Because here's what the research actually shows. A landmark longitudinal study tracking personality across decades found that the traits that shift most dramatically between early adulthood and middle adulthood are agreeableness, conscientiousness, and emotional stability. And they tend to move in the same direction across almost every culture studied. People generally become more patient, more deliberate, more emotionally regulated as they age. This isn't self-help, it's biology interacting with experience. Which raises a quieter, more interesting idea. Maybe the version of you that emerges after 30 isn't entirely who you chose to become. Maybe it's who you were always becoming, and the circumstances of your 20s were simply the pressure required to reveal it. There's a concept in developmental psychology called post-traumatic growth. The idea that difficulty doesn't just leave damage, it can also leave expansion, a broader perspective, a clearer set of values, a deeper tolerance for ambiguity. Researchers have found that adults who reflect on significant life changes often describe those periods not as the time they lost themselves, but as the time they finally stopped pretending to be someone they never quite were. That quiet moment in your 30s, the one where you look up and wonder when you became this person, isn't disorientation. It might just be the first time you're seeing yourself clearly. And maybe that's not something to mourn. Maybe that's something worth sitting with.